In a world drowning in noise, where truth often gets lost in the echo chamber of curated laughs and prepackaged outrage, there are rare moments when clarity cuts through. Moments when the script is torn up and the unexpected becomes the undeniable. This is one of those stories. A story about a battle fought not with shouts, but with stillness. Not with insults, but with unyielding truth. If you believe in the power of conviction, if you crave the raw force of reality over the polished facade of entertainment, then lean in. Like this story, share it with those who need to hear it, and subscribe to this channel. Because what you are about to read isn't just a tale of defiance, it's a blueprint for a cultural reset. The email was plain, deceptively so. No vibrant header, no playful emojis, no flourish of digital confetti. Just the stark, unadorned words, invitation to appear, Jimmy Kimmel Live. Karoline Leavitt stared at the screen, a flicker of something beyond amusement crossing her features. It was recognition, a deep, immediate understanding that settled in her gut like a cold stone. She knew exactly what this was. Not an olive branch of conversation, not a spark of genuine curiosity. This was a setup. The kind late-night shows had perfected into an art form, honed over decades of carefully constructed mockery. They invite someone they can frame, someone whose words they can twist, whose image they can distort. They clip the laugh lines, surgically excise context, and spin a narrative so tightly woven it leaves no room for dissent. She had seen it happen countless times, to others. But Karoline Leavitt wasn't like the others. She wasn't a political pundit easily flustered, nor a celebrity seeking a moment in the sun. She was a force of conviction, armed with a quiet certainty that few possessed. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, then descended with purpose. One word, a single defiant declaration that sealed her fate, and, unbeknownst to the late-night empire, theirs too. Accepted. She knew it wasn't going to be fair. The deck was stacked, the audience primed, the host armed with an arsenal of pre-written zingers. She also knew with a chilling clarity that it didn't matter. She wasn't walking into that studio for applause. She wasn't seeking validation from a crowd conditioned to laugh on cue. She was walking in with something far more potent, clarity. Armed not with jokes, but with truth, unvarnished, unapologetic. By the end of that interview, it wouldn't be the host making headlines. It would be her. Not with a rant born of rage, not with a theatrical walk-off designed for drama. No, it would be with one single, precise sentence, a sentence that would ripple through the very fabric of television, politics, and social media by sunrise. That night, America wouldn't get the performance Jimmy Kimmel had meticulously planned. They would get a reality he was utterly unprepared for. The audience wouldn't laugh. They would listen. And when she finally spoke that sentence, the very air in the studio would shift permanently. Because Karoline Leavitt didn't come to survive late night. She came to flip it. The green room buzzed with a tension that hummed like a live wire. Makeup artists darted in and out, their brushes a flurry of motion. Stage managers barked urgent commands into headsets, their voices sharp, almost frantic. Producers whispered into handheld mics, their hushed tones carrying an undercurrent of controlled chaos. It was the orchestrated frenzy of a well-oiled machine, calibrated for one purpose, to produce a spectacle. But amidst the swirling energy, Karoline Leavitt didn't flinch. She sat still, a beacon of quiet defiance. She had chosen a magenta blazer, its vibrant hue catching the overhead lights not with flashiness, but with a subtle, almost defiant glow. There was no entourage fussing over her, no stylist making last-minute adjustments, no stack of meticulously prepared notes, no team of consultants whispering strategies into her ear. Just her, alone, composed, ready. Her hands rested gently in her lap,
a picture of unbothered calm, her back straight, eyes forward. It was the same posture she held during high-stakes press briefings, a silent testament to her unwavering focus. Except now, instead of a room full of reporters, she was facing a studio, built, piece by carefully constructed piece, to laugh at her. Backstage, just beyond the heavy velvet curtain, Jimmy Kimmel paced. A set of cue cards, thick with punchlines, were clutched in his hand. His writers, a gaggle of sharp-witted wordsmiths, were still chuckling at the zingers they'd painstakingly prepared. Jokes about Trump, jokes about Karoline's age, a thinly veiled attempt to dismiss her as inexperienced. One-liners about conspiracy theories and White House interns, all designed to do what late night does best: frame the guest, mock the sound bites, and, most importantly, control the room. Jimmy rehearsed his opening, a smirk already playing on his lips. "She's just old enough to rent a car," he intoned, his voice dripping with practiced sarcasm, "if she promises not to drive it into a conspiracy theory." The room behind the curtain erupted in the desired laughter. That was the tone they wanted to set. But that wasn't the tone they were about to get. When Karoline's name was called, the applause was polite, safe. It was the kind of applause given out of habit, not excitement. The audience, a sea of expectant faces, didn't quite know what to expect. As she stepped into the blinding glare of the studio lights, her heels echoed on the stage, each click deliberate, each stride anchored in an almost unnerving confidence. She moved not like a nervous guest, but like someone who owned the space. Jimmy leaned forward in his chair, his signature smirk firmly in place. "Well, Karoline," he began, his voice laced with patronizing amusement, "this is either very brave or very foolish." He waited for the flinch, the nervous laugh, the hesitant reply. He got neither. Karoline met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. She didn't blink. "Then let's find out which," she replied, her voice clear, calm, and utterly devoid of fear. The audience, caught off guard, laughed. But it wasn't the derisive laughter Jimmy had anticipated. It was laughter with her. Jimmy paused. The smirk faltered just for a fraction of a second. That wasn't how this was supposed to go. He tried to pivot, to regain control of the narrative. "I'll be honest," he said, forcing a tight smile. "When I heard the White House was sending someone to defend Trump, I figured they'd send someone more seasoned." He expected a stumble, a blush, perhaps a fumbled defense. Karoline simply tilted her head, a hint of a gentle smile playing on her lips. "They did offer him the job," she said smoothly, her voice cutting through the studio air with surgical precision. "But he declined, said you were using all the seasoning." The crowd erupted. This time, the laughter was genuine, loud, and entirely at Jimmy Kimmel's expense. The gleam in his eye dimmed. The game had begun, and Karoline Leavitt had just taken the first, unexpected move.
Jimmy forced a chuckle, a strained sound that barely masked the surprise in his eyes. The gleam had indeed dimmed. He pushed forward, a seasoned performer accustomed to controlling the narrative, to dominating the room. He mocked her age again, a tired tactic, questioning her loyalty, taking predictable shots at her values, her political affiliations, her very presence in the White House. He expected a flustered defense, a stammered excuse, a moment of vulnerability he could exploit for a cheap laugh. Instead, Karoline parried every insult, every loaded question with a calm that was almost unnerving. "How do you sleep at night defending policies that controversial?" he asked, his voice laced with the self-righteous indignation that usually silenced his guests. He anticipated a flustered explanation, a desperate attempt to justify. Instead, she answered with a clear conscience, her gaze steady, and then, with a deliberate motion, she gestured to a thick, unassuming binder resting beside her chair. "Unlike some," she said, her voice even, "who rely on cue cards and applause signs, I come armed with facts." A few claps scattered through the audience, hesitant and unprompted. Some people stayed silent, their expressions shifting from amusement to something akin to curiosity. But many now were watching her, not him. This wasn't the shy assistant stumbling through talking points. This was someone who had come prepared, not for applause, but for truth. Every response from Karoline was sharp, yet respectful, calm, yet undeniable. The room, designed to laugh at her, started doing something rare, something Jimmy Kimmel hadn't experienced in years. It started listening. Jimmy's jokes kept coming, a barrage of pre-written jabs, but for the first time they weren't landing. The usual rhythm, the back and forth where he threw punches and his guests either flinched or fumbled, wasn't working. Karoline Leavitt wasn't rattled. She wasn't retreating. She was a rock against his tide of sarcasm. He shifted in his chair, a subtle sign of his growing discomfort. The air in the studio, usually light with manufactured mirth, was growing heavy with an unexpected gravity. So, he did what every host does when the punchlines aren't landing, when the carefully constructed facade begins to crack. He reached for the nuclear button. "Let's talk about January 6th, he said, his voice dropping to a low, loaded tone, designed to convey seriousness, to imply a moral high ground. A few audience members straightened up, sensing the sudden sharp tension. This was it, the big one. The moment designed to expose, to condemn. You still defend the guy who sent people to the Capitol? His words hung heavy in the air, sharp enough to cut. He expected hesitation, a pause, maybe a desperate dodge, a deflection. He got neither. Karoline met his stare, her eyes calm, clear, and utterly unyielding. "I defend the right of every American," she stated, her voice resonating with conviction, "to be treated with the same standard of justice, even when the media decides someone's guilty before the facts come out." That alone shifted the air, a palpable ripple through the studio. But she wasn't done. "You watched what your producers chose to air," she continued, her voice gaining a quiet power. "You didn't see the withheld footage, the hours of people walking in and out peacefully, because that doesn't sell ads." A soft murmur rolled through the crowd. No laughter, just discomfort. Jimmy tried to laugh, but it came out thin, reedy. This was different. He leaned forward, raising the stakes, desperate to regain control. "So what, you think the media is the problem?" Karoline nodded slowly, a deliberate, almost dismissive gesture. "If you're going to ask questions like a prosecutor, Jimmy, then admit you're showing one side of the evidence. Or is that not part of the joke?" Silence. Not the kind that sets up a punchline, the kind that follows a truth no one knows how to answer. Jimmy's staff, usually relaxed behind the cameras, were frozen. The band stayed still. Even the applause sign didn't flicker. The stage was set for the inevitable. Jimmy tapped his cards nervously, the crisp edges now feeling useless in his hand. He was still fishing, desperate for something solid, something familiar to latch onto. "Well, for someone so young," he stammered, reaching for sarcasm, "you sure don't laugh much." Karoline smiled gently, a genuine, almost pitying curve of her lips. "I laugh," she replied, her voice soft but unwavering, "just not when people use a national platform to mislead millions and call it entertainment." The blow didn't come from volume, it came from precision. It wasn't a shout, it was a surgical strike. He tried again, his voice tinged with exasperation. "So, you're saying you're better than me?" She shook her head, the movement slow and deliberate. "No," she corrected him, "I'm saying I came prepared. You interview celebrities, I breathe the nation." The crowd was leaning in now, no longer a passive audience, but active participants in an unfolding drama. Jimmy looked less like a host and more like a man trying desperately to reclaim lost ground, the ground that was rapidly eroding beneath his feet. "All right," he conceded, grasping at straws. "How about media bias? You always talk about it. That's your favorite phrase, isn't it?" Karoline leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees, her posture of one of engaged seriousness. "It's not a favorite," she stated, her voice clear and resonant. "It's a fact. When headlines contradict reality, people lose trust. When that trust breaks, democracy weakens. Whether it's about elections, law enforcement, or even late-night TV. Jimmy blinked. "Are you accusing me of weakening democracy?" She didn't raise her voice. "I'm accusing you of doing exactly what you say you're fighting, pushing narratives without context and calling it truth." A few claps rang out, stronger this time, not laughter but applause, and not because they were told to, but because it felt earned. Jimmy looked stunned. He tried one last desperate gambit. People say you're smart, so why defend someone like Trump? Karoline was ready. Every politician spends, she said, her gaze steady, but not every late-night host pretends he's not doing the same thing. That hit harder than anything else so far. His smile froze, his rhythm collapsed. The band stayed quiet. His writers behind the camera weren't laughing, they weren't even moving. Desperate, Jimmy pivoted. "Let's talk Twitter. You think Trump should have stayed on the platform?" "Of course," she replied. "You don't protect democracy by silencing half of it, even when it's inconvenient." She paused, then asked, her voice quiet but piercing, "By the way, when you get something wrong on your show, should it be taken off air too?" The crowd didn't laugh, they absorbed it. The tension was thick, but it wasn't hostile. It was awakening. This wasn't comedy anymore. This was a cross-examination, and Jimmy wasn't asking the questions, he was answering them. Karoline leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. The studio lights above cast a sharp outline around her, but she didn't flinch. She wasn't performing, she was delivering truth, unscripted and uncensored. Then, with a calm, almost quiet intensity, she spoke the sentence that had been sitting in the back of her mind since she first stepped on stage. "You don't do comedy anymore, Jimmy. You do damage control with a punchline." It landed like a thunderclap. There was no drum roll, no applause sign flashing, no forced laughter, just silence. Sharp. Total. A full second passed, then another, and then slowly it began. One clap. Then three, then a ripple of real, unprompted applause, the kind that isn't triggered by programming, but by conviction. Kimball's eyes narrowed, his mouth parted slightly as if to speak, but no words came. He stared across at Karoline like he just realized he was sitting opposite a force he hadn't prepared for. Karoline didn't smirk, she didn't soak it in, she simply sat upright and continued. Comedy used to punch up, now it parrots headlines with laugh tracks. Another wave through the audience. Some clapped, others just stared. But no one laughed, not at her and not with him. The air had shifted. The cameras were still rolling, the credits hadn't even started, but the clip was already spreading like wildfire. A stagehand backstage whispered, "That's gonna trend." He was right. Within minutes, the sentence was clipped, subtitled, and shared across every major platform. On X, the hashtag damage control surged to the top 5. Conservative influencers reposted it with captions like, "She nuked him," and "Karoline Leavitt just rewrote late-night history." But it wasn't just conservatives. Independents and even a few liberal commentators admitted it. Something seismic had just happened on that stage. By midnight, the most viewed clip had over 2 million plays. YouTube Shorts, TikToks, Reels, it didn't matter where you looked, it was there. The moment she leaned forward calm and deliberate and dropped the sentence that ended the illusion. It was short, it was sharp, and it was undeniable. Podcasters were already pulling sound bites for their morning uploads. One commentator put it bluntly, Kimmel invited her to be the joke. Instead, she became the headline. By the next morning, the clip had reached cable news. Fox News ran it with the headline, "Karoline Leavitt flips late-night script." The Daily Wire called it the moment comedy died. Even CNN covered the fallout, albeit cautiously, debating whether Kimmel had walked into his own trap. One panelist said, "She didn't just win, she changed the game." Another quietly nodded and said, "That was surgical, and that's what made it so powerful." Karoline hadn't gone on the attack. She hadn't raised her voice or cracked under pressure. She hadn't insulted or derailed. She had stayed calm, poised, and relentlessly truthful. And the country noticed. College debate teams started citing the exchange as an example of controlled rebuttal. Communication professors dissected her delivery in lecture halls, analyzing the power of quiet conviction. On campuses, young voters shared the clip not because of the politics, but because of the tone. "She didn't yell, she made sense," one student posted. A simple truth that resonated deeply. Older viewers, too, found something familiar in her calm strength. A retired teacher wrote, "Reminded me of Reagan. Firm, smart, unshaken." And while the internet ignited, Jimmy Kimmel's team went completely silent. No tweets, no rebuttals, no late-night monologue the next day addressing the moment. Just a quiet, unsettling pause. Internally,
Reports leaked that his producers were in panic mode. One former staffer said, "We thought we were setting the trap, but she had the map." Writers huddled, executives held emergency meetings. One memo reportedly asked, "Is this still the format people want?" Meanwhile, Karoline released just one statement on her social media. No gloating, no drama. Just a single profound sentence. Truth is undefeated when you let it speak without a filter. It was shared over 1 million times within 24 hours. Commentators praised her. Even critics admitted she had come prepared and executed flawlessly. But more than that, people saw the difference. She didn't survive Kimmel, she dismantled him. And she did it without sarcasm, without spectacle. She did it with composure and truth. Memes flooded the internet. One showed Jimmy frozen behind his desk with the caption, "When the guest becomes the host." Another split-screened Karoline with the words, "The calm before the storm and during it." Even late-night rivals took notice. One anonymous comedian tweeted, "It's not the guest's job to make the host look smart, especially when the guest came smarter." This wasn't just a viral moment, it was a cultural reset. It raised questions in Hollywood writer rooms and editorial boardrooms alike. What happens when the format that always worked, sarcasm, mockery, dismissal, suddenly fails? What happens when the audience stops laughing and starts thinking? Karoline Leavitt didn't just walk into the lion's den, she walked out with the spotlight. She didn't raise her voice, she raised the bar. And by the time the next week rolled around, one thing was clear across political lines, age groups, and media channels. Karoline hadn't been invited to be ridiculed, she had been summoned for a setup. But instead of playing her part, she rewrote the script, and the fallout was only beginning. Karoline didn't give a single interview in the days that followed. No press appearances, no media circuit, no attempts to ride the wave. She let the moment speak for itself. When a reporter called her team asking for a response to the viral explosion, they got a single sentence in return. "It was never about me. It was about telling the truth in a room that forgot what it sounded like." That quote alone was posted, reposted, and screenshotted by millions. It soared past 1 million likes on every platform. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't combative, but it was real. And that's what people were starving for. Clarity without the noise. Even voices from across the aisle couldn't deny it. A well-known political columnist who had previously criticized Karoline wrote, "She didn't humiliate him, she revealed the cracks in a format that's gone unchallenged for too long." One television critic noted, "What she did wasn't combative, it was corrective, and that's what stood out." Karoline never raised her voice, she didn't insult, she didn't gloat. She simply held a mirror to the stage and made everyone look into it. And the reflection wasn't flattering. Back at Jimmy Kimmel Live, the aftermath was impossible to ignore. He returned to his desk the next evening, trying to reset the tone. But something was different. He opened with a few jokes. They didn't land. He paused. The audience paused with him, but not in laughter. It felt forced, uncertain. Writers behind the scenes whispered. A producer leaned over and said, "The rhythm's off." Jimmy felt it too. There was no confidence in his delivery. His sarcasm felt hollow. The usual crowd energy gone. The jokes weren't just missing, they were being weighed against something heavier now. Truth. And suddenly the usual punchlines didn't feel enough. Inside network executives' meetings, there were real conversations taking place. Do we need to shift the tone? Are viewers done with smug? Another added. Writers brainstormed ways to re-energize the show, but no matter what they proposed, everything was being measured against Karoline's appearance. Not because she had roasted the host, but because she'd brought clarity. No script, no cue cards, no filters, just facts. Delivered calmly. And that struck a chord. Meanwhile, Karoline's name began to rise in conversations that had nothing to do with late night. Political strategists started discussing her as a future candidate. Donors asked if she had plans to run. Think tanks invited her to speak on the decline of institutional trust. Even conservative groups circulated the full interview as a training tool, how to dismantle narrative with reason. Even some liberals admitted in podcasts that while they didn't agree with her politics, her performance had been unshakably honest. But Karoline didn't engage the speculation. She gave no hint of next steps. When asked by a journalist what she thought of Kimmel's reaction, she replied simply, "Comedy has its place, but when jokes replace facts, the people suffer. That clip was clipped and shared just as widely, and once again it struck a nerve. In classrooms, students analyzed the dynamic of the interview, how tone changed the trajectory, how calm could overwhelm sarcasm. In media rooms, editors debated whether late-night hosts needed to rethink their tactics. In living rooms across America, people replayed the clip, not because they needed to, but because it felt different. It wasn't noise, it wasn't spin, it was clarity. Karoline didn't just walk away from the interview untouched, she walked away having reset the bar. She didn't come to dominate Jimmy Kimmel, she came to show that truth doesn't need permission to land. And when delivered right, it doesn't need applause to echo. She didn't win by being loud, she won by being prepared. And in doing so, she left a mark not just on one show, but on the whole idea of what public discourse could still look like.